My name is Erin Turner. I'm a senior here at UVM. I'm an education major. I just recently finished up my student teaching in the fall. I completed that at Hunt Middle School in Burlington. Um, took this class because I thought it was interesting to learn about people's minds and why they decide to engage in certain activities and exactly what deviance is and how I see that every day in my life. I think it's also good, especially being an education major, to learn about how deviance affects all groups of people and all ages, and it doesn't really matter who you are, you still are prone to deviance and you can still be engaged in deviance. Um, yep. So today I'm going to be discussing Citizenfour, which was the documentary about Edward Snowden and his involvement in exploiting some confidential information from the United States government and the surveillance. I found this to be an interesting documentary just because of a lot of recent events going on with President Trump and allegations of conspiracy and ties to Russia. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the movie right now, and then I'll go into the recent events. Citizenfour was released in 2014. The main characters involved are Edward Snowden, the director, Laura Poitras, not sure how to say her last name, and Glenn Greenwald. Greenwald is the one who ends up writing about and reporting on all the information that Edward Snowden gives to him. And the other character, Laura, she is the one who directs the film. So I thought it was interesting how most of the film takes place in a hotel room. I thought that was kind of weird because it's a very important topic, being that it involves the United States government and surveillance. It just seems like it should have taken place in somewhere other than a hotel room. But I guess I do understand that it was controversial and they had to keep it a secret. And these meetings had to be very private. I just thought it was interesting that a majority of the film is in a hotel room. So that was one thing that stood out to me. Citizenfour, there's 3 themes that I chose to discuss here in this video. The first one was this idea of the ruling versus the ruled, which basically was referred to as people versus kind of like the government, or like the man, and that idea of the government almost gets to be the ruler over people, which is interesting because when we're talking about something like surveillance and people's personal property and their own personal computers and text messages and anything that they're sending, it seems that that shouldn't really be something that the government would have control over. If that's a personal computer, phone, or anything, it's your own business, it's your own property. So that's kind of what this whole documentary centers around, is that idea of, well, what does the government get to control and how much free speech do we actually have? Overall, I thought it was a super interesting documentary. It must have been very challenging for Edward Snowden to decide that he wanted to leak this information, because he did put himself in kind of a bad situation where some people were very against him because he was speaking out against actions of his government. And then there's another side of the argument where people supported him and he took the side of the people, and he wanted the people to know, he says that at one point, that he wanted the people to know that the government was doing these things and that they were being watched and their personal life was not so personal. So I thought that was one of the themes that really stood out. Another theme, there's a quote I have written down here. It was this idea of like politics versus law. So when it comes to free speech, obviously that's in our Constitution. We have the right to free speech. But I think it was one of the lawyers at one point toward the end of the documentary says, I think we realize that this will be 95% politics and only 5% law and how this gets resolved, which I thought was a very interesting quote because it shouldn't be politics deciding something like this. It should be law. It's right or wrong. At least to me, that's the way that it seems. It shouldn't be based on political views or like who someone supports or if it actually is a law or not. It seems that it should be just the law, whether it's right or wrong, what he did or what the government is doing. Is it okay for them to be tracking and keeping information about the personal lives of people? And even in the documentary, they say it's not like they were watching people who they considered to be criminal or to be threats. It was just people, everyday people like you and I, and they were just keeping their phone records for no particular reason, just storing them, which personally I don't like. I wouldn't, not that I have anything particularly interesting, but I just don't like the idea that I could have been one of those people whose texts they were reading or whose emails they were keeping just to like have on file. So yeah, the whole idea of politics versus law, right or wrong, just the fact that he says 95% politics and 5% law, and they all kind of agree with it, that kind of stood out to me. And then the last theme was just the whole idea of free speech. Obviously, we all know that's in the Constitution. We have that free speech amendment. It's in the First Amendment. But as far as what that actually does protect is definitely a key theme in this documentary. Does the government have the right to infringe upon people's personal property? Which personally, to me, I would say no, especially when it comes to just regular people like myself. They could have been looking at anything that I had, but it seems wrong. But people have certain reasons as to why they do things. So those were the three things. There's the idea of the ruling versus the ruled, government and people. Does the government have the right to store information from people? They don't necessarily have grounds to do so. The idea of politics and law. How much politics should play into something like this, or should it just be based upon the law? And then the last one was just the idea of free speech. How much are we actually technically considered to have when it comes to government surveillance or saying things about the government? Was Edward Snowden right or wrong about what he did, but was it also right or wrong for the government to be collecting information on just random people? So that's what I got out of the documentary for the themes. One of the things that I liked and disliked about the documentary, I'll start with the things that I didn't like. One of the things that kind of stood out to me was Glenn Greenwald's partner at the time when he came to the airport and he was just randomly taken in for, I think it said 8 hours, just because of his connection. I just thought it didn't involve him. He shouldn't have been involved in it. It seemed kind of wrong to me that he would have been held for such a long period of time when he was not necessarily involved in it. It seemed like that was kind of almost a personal attack because Greenwald was exposing this story. So I definitely didn't like that personal relationships are being brought into this. Another thing that I've already kind of mentioned before was that most of the documentary is spent in a hotel. I just thought that was kind of weird, being that it was such a high-profile case and it made the news. I mean, it was a big deal. Just seemed like they would have done it somewhere a little bit more professional, I guess, rather than Edward Snowden kind of just lounging in a hotel room in the bed. And the only other thing that I just didn't really understand was why the director was never really shown in the documentary at all. It only had like her conversations that were like being typed out on the computer between her and Edward Snowden. I thought it was kind of strange that she wouldn't, I don't know, kind of like put a face with her own documentary, like her sitting there interviewing him in the hotel room. So yeah, a little bit more involvement from her physically in the documentary, I think would have made it a little bit better, because then you would have seen all of the components. You would have seen her, you would have seen Snowden, and you would have seen Greenwald. So those were three of the things that I disliked about it. But what I did like was just the whole conversation about free speech and what is protected, what is not. And then it kind of brought in, I'm really into history, so it brought in some of the like espionage acts and things from like World War II, World War One, where they discuss how much people can say and how much like what crosses the line. So I kind of liked how they kept bringing that in, and I just overall thought that it kind of brought up a good debate about free speech, and especially in the political climate that we're in now. There's a lot going on in this country, and people are saying and doing a lot of things that are considered, I don't know, on the borderline of being deviant or just like socially unacceptable things that people are saying about other people. So I think this was a good film to watch at this time, just based on what's going on in our world today, just not even in the United States alone, but like particularly the United States. I guess we could think about a lot of things. So yeah, I just liked that they brought up free speech and they kind of got a lot of different opinions about it, and they talked to the lawyers and Snowden and kind of got his opinion as to why he decided to do this, because he really did put himself in a situation where he could have gotten in a lot more trouble than I guess he did. Yep, so that would be probably the number one thing that I liked, was the discussion of free speech. I watched this documentary. I was looking at some recent events and articles that kind of related to the topics discussed in Citizenfour, and I found an article about China, and it was basically about this rating system that China has created. I actually wrote down a quote from it. So basically, what happens is they'll just take like a sampling of people and they'll rate them based upon like social media accounts or emails or anything they find about someone. So basically, what would a result of getting a high score on the rating test would be that you would be allowed faster internet access in China. So this quote that I found from the article says, if you make political posts online without a permit or question and contradict the government official narrative on current events, however, your score decreases. So if you speak ill of your government, or if you post something that might compromise your government or anyone in the government, your score decreases and you therefore cannot get a high score. So this kind of gets at the themes of like human rights, which was kind of seen a little bit in Snowden's documentary, because unlike Snowden's documentary, where he was just talking about the government and what they were doing, this is kind of role reversal, where the government itself is rating people based upon what they're saying, which is kind of taking away like also freedom of expression. People should have access and should be able to post whatever they want on their own personal social media, like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. That should be up to them, considering it's their own page. However, the government in China now, since they have this rating system, they're kind of taking away from people and what they can post in certain places, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think if you make your own account, you should be held accountable to what's on it, but you also shouldn't be treated differently or rated or just kind of like looked down upon, I guess, because of what you're posting. So I thought that was an interesting article. Kind of gets at the same idea of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, what is and what isn't okay to put on social media. But overall, I would say that Citizenfour was a great documentary. I thought it was well produced. I really liked how it was like a very personal feel to it, where you have Snowden and you have Glenn Greenwald, and they're just like constantly in a dialogue together, and they have these personal conversations, but they also have ones about the issues at hand. Yeah, overall, I would say it was a great documentary, and it touched upon some great issues, and a lot that are still relevant in 2018, despite being 4 years old. This documentary, I think it still is very relevant to the United States we live in today.